My name is Antotela Martinez.
My name is Aya,
and we're going to talk about Douglas Brown's book, The Principles of Language Learning and Teaching.
Chapter 8, Cross-Linguistic Inference and Learned Language.
In the middle of the 20th century, one of the most popular pursuits for applied linguistics was the study of two languages in contrast. Eventually, the stockpile of contrastive and comparative data on a multiple of pairs of languages yielded what came to be known the contrastive analysis hypothesis. This was deeply rooted on a structuralist and behaviorist approach, and claimed that the principal barrier to second language acquisition was the interference of the first language system with the second language system. And the structural scientific analysis of the two languages would yield on a taxonomy of linguistic contrast between them, which in turn would enable the linguist to predict difficulties in the learner would encounter. It was at that time considered feasible that tools from structural linguistics would enable a linguist to describe accurately both languages in question and then match the two descriptions to determine valid contrast or differences between them. They considered that second language learning was overcoming those differences or difficulties between the two languages, the native and the target language. Such claims were supported by what some researchers called empirical method of prediction. A well-known method was proposed by Stockwell, Bowen, and Martin in 1865, who proposed what they called a hierarchy of difficulties. This included a hierarchy taking into account phonetic features that have 8 levels of difficulty, and another that included structural grammatical features that included 16 levels of difficulty. In 1967, Prater captured the essence of these hierarchies and created a new one with 6 levels of difficulties that included phonological and grammatical features. The first one is level 0 and is called transfer. No differences or contrast is present between the two languages. There is one-to-one correspondence. An example of these are sounds or words that are very similar from one language to another. Level 1 is called coalescence. Two items from the native language are coalesced into just one item in the target language. For example, the possessive pronouns his, her in English are just su in Spanish. You say her, his dog, but su perro. Level 2 is called under-differentiation. An item from the native language is absent in the target language, so the learner has to avoid the item. For example, the English do as tense carrier. Level 3 is called reinterpretation. An item from a native language is given a new shape or distribution. For example, when a Spanish-English learner hears the word sensitive, he thinks of the word in Spanish sensible, and in fact, that's not the meaning. Level 4 is called over-differentiation. An entirely new item has to be learned in the target language. For example, for an English speaker, the Spanish grammatical gender. Level 5 is split. An item from the native language is split into 2 parts in the target language. For example, the verb di in Spanish is ser o estar. Ronald Markov called this contrastive analysis hypothesis the strong version of it. He also mentions a weak version that also recognizes the significance of interference across languages, but also recognizes that linguistic difficulties can be more profitably explained after the error appears. The so-called weak version of the contrastive analysis hypothesis is what now is called cross-linguistic inference.
Now I'm going to talk about markedness. Markedness is a term introduced by the very famous professor of linguistics, Fred Ekman, who proposed a very useful method for identifying difficulties. His theory was called markedness differential hypothesis or markedness theory. This theory was about identifying the member of a pair of relative structures, while the author identifies unmarked structures and marked structures. The unmarked structures are those that are more general and easy to understand and learn, and the marked structures are those that are more complex and have at least one more feature than the unmarked ones, and so they are more difficult to understand and learn. A very common example is that of the indefinite articles a and n. A would be the unmarked structure and n would be the marked structure. Something very important to mention is that all these levels of markedness has to do with different levels of difficulties. Identifying and describing errors. The contrastive analysis hypothesis has stated that learning the second language is the same as learning all the features that differ from that of the first language. What's wrong with this theory is that it doesn't cover all the interlinguistic features. It's also important to say that the second language learner makes a lot of elements, features, and knowledges together. For example, the knowledge of the first language, the limited knowledge of the target language, knowledges of the language in general, and knowledges about life, human beings, and the universe. From the 60s, the point of view of teachers have changed. First, students were seen as producers of malformed and incorrect language for mistakes. But from 1960, they were seen as intelligent and creative beings going through a logical process of acquisition. Something the author focuses on is that they don't share the same system, I mean the second language learner and the native speaker. And the system used by the second language learners has been described by many authors in different ways. For example, interlanguage approximative system, idiosyncratic dialect, and learner's language. Error analysis. Human learning is a process full of mistakes. For example, you cannot learn to ride a bike without falling at least once. The same happens with language, either first language or second language. You must make a lot of mistakes to reach what is called the grammatically correct. The first distinction that the teacher must make to analyze errors is to differentiate mistakes from errors. Mistakes don't involve lack of competence. So you can correct yourself immediately. It just has to do with the misuse of the correct system. Whereas errors do involve lack of competence, and you cannot correct yourself immediately. There are two types of errors: overt errors and covert errors. Overt errors are ones that are considered ungrammatically correct at sentence level, and covert errors are those that are considered maybe grammatically correct at sentence level, but ungrammatically in context. Errors in error analysis. One of the most common errors in error analysis has to do with giving too much importance to errors. This could be very dangerous because you could lose the free communication and the positive reinforcement in your classroom. Another very common error is to give too much importance to the production activities, those that have to do with writing and speaking, because errors are easier to be spot them, and not give too much importance to the comprehensive skills, those that have to do with reading and listening.
Our final step in the analysis of erroneous in speech is that of determining the source of error. So the question is, why are certain errors made? Interlingual transfer is a significant source of error for all or if the learner is attempting a third language shortly after beginning a second language. Researchers have found that once learners have begun to acquire parts of a new system, more and more interlingual transfer, that is, generalization, within the target language is manifested. Negative interlingual transfer, or overgeneralization, also occurs. It consists on generalizing a particular item or rule in the second language beyond legitimate bounds. A clear example of this is to overgeneralize regular past tense endings as applicable to all past tense forms, for example, goat instead of went. A third major source of error is the context of learning. Context refers, for example, to the classroom. In a classroom context, the teacher or even the textbook can lead the student to make faulty hypotheses of the language, called false concepts or induced errors. Students can make errors from misleading explanations from the teacher, faulty presentations, or even because the pattern was memorized but improperly conceptualized. The social linguistic context of natural language acquisition can give rise to certain dialects that may itself be a source of error. Learners use production strategies in order to get their messages across, but at times these techniques can become also source of errors. The first is a stage of random errors called pre-systematic, in which the learners are vaguely aware that there is a systematic order to a particular item, a class of items. In this stage, English learners may say inconsistencies like John can sing, John can't sing, or John can't sing it. In the second or emergent stage, the learner has begun to acquire a system and internalize certain rules, but still he is unable to correct errors when they are pointed out by someone else. Finally, avoidance of structures and topics is typical in this stage. The third stage is a purely systematic stage. Those rules that are stored in the learner's brain are not well formed yet, but of course they are closer to the target language system. And at this stage, the learner has the ability to correct the errors when they are pointed out. The final stage is called post-systematic. Here, the learner has relatively few errors and has mastered the system to a point that fluency and intended meaning are not problematic. This stage is characterized by the learner's ability to self-correct, and at this point, the learners manifest fossilization, a concept that will be explained later.
Fossilization is the relatively permanent incorporation of incorrect linguistic forms into a person's second language competence. It is mainly manifested phonologically in foreign accents, when the person had learned the language after poverty. It is also manifested in the speech of those who had acquired the language quite well, in the form of persistent syntactic and lexical errors. It is a normal and natural stage for many learners, and it should be seen as a phenomenon that can be reversed. So, how do items become fossilized? Some researchers explain that fossilization is the result of positive and negative affective and cognitive feedback. They noted that there are two kinds of information transmitted between sources and audiences, that is to say, between learners and native speakers or any speaker of the language. These two kinds of information are affective information about the relationship among learners and audience that is expressed through body language, gestures, and the tone of the voice, and cognitive information like ideas, thoughts, and facts that are expressed through linguistic forms like sounds, phrases, and structures. The feedback learners can get from the audience can be positive, negative, or somewhere in between, neutral. The two types and levels of feedback are: in the affective feedback, positive means keep talking, I'm listening. Neutral feedback means I'm not sure I want to maintain this conversation. And negative means this conversation is over. In the cognitive feedback, positive means I understand you, it's clear. Neutral means I am not sure I understand you correctly. And negative means I don't understand you, it's not clear. This model suggests that a positive affective feedback encourages the learner to keep trying to communicate, and the cognitive feedback determines the degree of internalization. Neutral and negative cognitive feedback encourage the learner to restate or rephrase what he or she had said. If there was a positive affective feedback before. So, according to this model, fossilized items are those deviant items who have received positive affective and cognitive feedback reinforcing an incorrect form of the language. But, according to other researchers, fossilization not only depends on extrinsic feedback but also on internal factors to the learner. What teachers should do with errors? Correct them, ignore them, how to correct them, and when to correct them. These are all difficult questions to answer. The most important point is that cognitive feedback should be optimal in order to be effective. Too much negative cognitive feedback and the learner won't try to communicate anymore, and too much positive cognitive feedback will reinforce the error of the learner. What we must avoid at all costs is the administration of punitive reinforcement, or what can be seen by the learner as a negative affective feedback that devaluates, dehumanized, or insulted. As regards the question of when to treat an error, teachers should differentiate between local and global errors, but global errors should be treated in some way since the message otherwise remains unclear. The matter of how to treat an error is extremely complex and researchers haven't agreed about it. It's clear that learners want and expect to be corrected in class. And it is also clear that native speakers don't correct learners so much. So, teachers have to find the happy medium between these two extremes. There are many ways of dealing with errors. For example, to treat them or ignore them, to treat them immediately or to delay the treatment, to treat it yourself or to transfer treatment, to go back to the error maker before treatment, etc. In order to know how to treat an error, the teacher should develop intuition through experience and theoretical background. All things considered, the teacher's task is to value the learners, prize their attempts to communicate, and then provide optimal feedback for the system to evolve into successful stages until the learner can communicate successfully.